Thank you, Matt. God, what a great temptation to push these buttons, but I'd best not. Good evening. My name is Frank Swoboda. I actually wrote that down. And I'm here to introduce our speaker for tonight. George Stevens Jr. is truly a man of the arts. Over the last half-century, he has created a legacy of extraordinary achievements as a writer, director, and producer of films, as an author, and most recently, as a playwright. His work has earned him 12 Emmys, 2 Peabody Awards, and 7 awards from the Writers Guild of America. But he doesn't deserve all that credit for this. It's in his genes. His father is George Stevens Sr., the legendary Hollywood film director and cinematographer. Stevens began working as an assistant to his father on the sets of such film productions as Shane, Giant, and The Diary of Anne Frank. He was the executive producer of the movie The Thin Red Line, which was nominated for 7 Academy Awards. He also co-wrote and produced The Murder of Mary Fagan, starring Jack Lemmon, which received television's Emmy Award for Outstanding Miniseries. More recently, in 2008, Stevens made his debut as a playwright on Broadway with Thurgood, starring Lawrence Fishburne as Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall. The play will open for a 3-week run at the Kennedy Center on June 1st, and I had to say that in lieu of paying an honorarium. In 1962, Edward R. Murrow picked Stevens to head the motion picture division of the United States Information Agency. 5 years later, he was a founder of the American Film Institute, where he served until 1980. And since 1978, Stevens has produced the Kennedy Center Honors, one of the major annual tributes to the arts in America. And last October, President Obama named Stevens co-chairman of the President's Committee on the Arts and Humanities. So what does all this have to do with the Herblock Foundation? Last year, the foundation commissioned Stevens to produce a documentary film about Herblock and his influence on his times. The film is part of the foundation's celebration of Herblock's centennial year, a celebration that began with the video we showed last year, the production of the book, Herblock, The Life and Work of the Great Political Cartoonist, and now the documentary, which is scheduled for completion in August. It's my pleasure to introduce George Stevens, Jr.
Thank you, Frank, Jean, Marcy, all the directors of the Herblock Foundation. It's, of course, quite an honor to be here. And further congratulations to Matt Worker. I'm a big fan of Politico, and it's great that you're recognized. And I'm sure that Herb would be very proud of the great work that you do. They said I could talk about anything I wanted to tonight, and I know a lot of people were curious about my thinking on arms reduction. But I chose to talk about Herb. And just thinking about him, you know, the Herb Block that we know and honor really emerged when a young Herbert L. Block left his job at the Daily News in native Chicago to go to Cleveland to be a cartoonist for the Newspaper Enterprise Institute, a syndication company that had the odd acronym NEA. He drew about the Depression. He drew about the New Deal and the rise of fascist dictators in Europe. And he didn't hesitate to let readers know that he thought isolationism was a threat to Main Street America. After a time, he couldn't help but notice that NEA, which was owned by Scripps Howard, was getting what he called jittery about his cartoons. His work was beginning to express sharper opinions than they were accustomed to, and NEA was concerned that if one of their papers dropped Herb, they might drop the entire service. So when he was summoned to New York by Fred Ferguson, the NEA president, who was known around the office as Little Napoleon, and who started meetings by saying, well, have you seen what Roosevelt said today? It was pretty clear that Herb was about to be fired. And he remembered sitting for a long time in the outer office, cooling his heels, until Ferguson finally summoned him inside with what Herb remembered as an anguished smile, an expression of mixed feelings never showed so clearly on a man's face, as Herb put it. It turned out that Ferguson had just been notified that Herb Bloch had been awarded the Pulitzer Prize. For a 32-year-old Herb, it meant that he kept his job, and he was on his way to becoming the foremost American political cartoonist. Now, I knew Herb for nearly 40 years, and now that I'm making a film about him in collaboration with my son Michael Stevens and my longtime associate Sarah Lukinson, who are here tonight, I'm getting to know him even a little better. This modest genius who spent 72 years working on the side of the little guy. Let's say he was a man for all seasons, 7 decades, observing and commenting on the events and compelling issues that shaped our history, from the stock market crash of 1929 to the new millennium. He drew 13 presidents, from Herbert Hoover to George W. Bush, and so many of those portraits do linger in the mind's eye, don't they? He created over 14,000 cartoons and wrote 12 books, and lest we forget, won 4 Pulitzer Prizes and the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Senator Barack Obama stood here at this podium in April 2005 and described what he called the simple and challenging philosophy that Herb's parents passed down to him, that being, be a good citizen and think about the other guy. Pretty simple. Herb remembered growing up in a world of horse-drawn milk wagons, long Sunday dinners, vaudeville houses, and lots of newspapers. No radios, no TVs, no jet planes, and the movies were silent. He was a Cubs fan, as he put it, at a time when there were 8 teams in each league, as God intended. He started drawing as a boy and recalled that his first picture was in chalk, and he drew it on the sidewalk out in front of his house. It was the likeness of the despised Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany, with his V-shaped mustache and the spike in his hat. Herb said, people could see my work, and I could feel satisfaction when that hateful face was walked on and stomped on. And that's when Herb first realized the power of his drawings to affect people's feelings. Shortly after Mr. Pulitzer saved Herb's job at NEA, Uncle Sam called, and he spent the rest of the war in the Army. And in 1946, he met a man who'd bought at auction the 4th rank of Washington, D.C.'s 4 newspapers. Publisher Eugene Meyer, perhaps better known today as the father of Katharine Graham, remembered or promised him editorial independence. And Herb's new job meant that every morning the leaders in this nation's capital would be reading the Washington Post cartoon, his cartoon, with their Post Toasties. Herb would have a voice in the national debate. And at some papers, editors tell their cartoonists what they would like that day, a cartoon on the election or a cartoon about the war. At other papers, the cartoonist does 1 or 2 or 3 cartoons and submits them to the editors, and they choose one or suggest changes. Well, Herb had a different kind of job. He decided on the subject. He did the research, calling upon reporters in the Post newsroom for special insight. And the cartoon he submitted went in the paper. sometimes 6 days a week. And the understanding worked pretty well until the election of 1952. Phil Gramm was now the publisher of the Post, and the Post was supporting General Eisenhower over Adlai Stevenson. Herb was drawing cartoons that were not altogether flattering about Ike and his running mate, Richard Nixon. As Election Day drew near, the editorial page editor informed Herb that the cartoons were embarrassing to Phil Gramm. So the Post pulled Herb's cartoons, but he still sent them out to his 200 newspaper syndicate. Now, we have learned, thanks to some research by Herb's longtime associate, Gene Rickard, that the Herb Block cartoons of October 28th, 29th, 30th, and 31st did not appear in the Washington Post that year. I thought you'd enjoy seeing what the fuss was about. Senator Joe McCarthy and Richard Nixon were kind of smearing Adlai Stevenson with some regularity. And here's Herb's October 29th cartoon, one of those that the Washington Post readers missed out on. I don't know what you can see from back there, but these two gentlemen, Richard Nixon and Joe McCarthy, with their tar brushes, have painted out the Stevenson poster and drawn a mustache on him. And Eisenhower is smiling benignly at them, saying, "Naughty, naughty." Well, the Stevenson campaign claimed censorship. The Washington Daily News ran an editorial about the missing cartoonist, and Post readers complained. And by November 1st, Herb's cartoons were back in the paper, where they would appear without further interruption until his dying day. A few years later, the Post was desperately short of cash, and Phil Gramm came to Herb saying he would exchange some of the Post's A stock for cash. The Post had by then moved up to be the capital's third-ranked newspaper, and Herb was a believer, so he plunked down his savings to invest in the paper he worked for. Now, what made Herb as good as he was? Well, it starts with his skill as an artist. He could draw and create caricature with the best of them, recalling Daumier and Thomas Nast. His caricatures were simple and fun, clear and concise. And his cartoons were informed by keen interest in politics and world affairs and driven by a reporter's intrepid curiosity. His brilliant sense of humor and passion for justice. And then there was his courage, the virtue that guaranteed the other qualities. And one might assume that this man who was capable of such savage satire would be a man of some darkness, not Herb. He was this modest, sweetly playful sort of man who loved to laugh. His friend Bob Asher said, Herb could boil down global complexities brilliantly, but he could never deal with the basics of existence, such as how to drive a car, buy a new refrigerator, or get to Virginia. Roger Rosenblatt had an office next to Herb's at one time, and he said it was like having your office next to the Marx Brothers. Herb had a cap that he called his thinking cap, a toy helmet topped with a light bulb that he could set blinking and come into somebody's office and say, "I have an idea." And while he fought off interference from above, he enjoyed taking 4 or 5 drafts out of the cartoon. I guess it was a great moment in the Washington Post newsroom around 4 o'clock where Herb would come out of the office in his shirt sleeves with 4 or 5 cartoons and seeking insights and opinions, not from above, but from below. And one friend described Herb shuffling around the Post in his slippers like Mr. Rogers. And his friend Kenneth Galbraith, John Kenneth Galbraith, noted, While Herb appreciates virtue, his real interest is in awfulness. He turns his attention to rascals, scoundrels, and frauds, and once they have been so identified, the odor, skunk-like, never leaves them. Often, Herb was just reminding public servants that they were, in fact, public servants. And his fellow cartoonist, Gary Trudeau, admired Herb's unwavering, as Gary described it, idealism and hope. I never thought of him either as a liberal or a conservative, but as a satirist, with a satirist's conviction that because this is America, there is always room for improvement. Herb knew that you didn't have to act tough to be tough. He knew that McCarthy was out to get him, but he never flinched. During Watergate, the newspaper was under great pressure, but Herb never pulled a punch. And years earlier, after having been rough on Richard Nixon in the 50s, when he was elected president, Herb decided the new president deserved a fresh start. He drew a cartoonist's office with pens and brushes and bowls, with the Stars and Stripes barber pole at the door, and there was a sign, "This shop gives to every new president of the United States a free shave, H. Block, proprietor." You know what's interesting about that? Herb was really talking to the American people. It wasn't just about him and Nixon. It was that we had a new president. He deserves his chance. So Richard Nixon had his clean shave, but it didn't last long. Herb's cartoons were commentary of what was on the front page of the day's newspaper, and I find it interesting how they've stood the test of time. Now, here's what Herb was thinking about in 1935. I'll help you a little bit because some of you are far in the back. At the top it says, natural resources and human greed. In the back you see the sign says, exhausted oil wells. In the midsection, denuded forest areas and wasted farmland. That was 1935, before environmentalist was a common term. There was Herb. And that same year, 1935, Herb had his eye on the Congress. And the heading says, hide and seek, and the investigator is going around, and the lobbyist is coming this way, and the congressman is watching. And in May of 2000, 65 years later, he was still on the case. It says, the little man, the little guy, the one with his sign, one person, one vote, and the guy with the cigar sitting on the Capitol, big money interests. And he's saying, it's still a representative government, form of government. They represent us, speaking of the Congress. Now, sometimes, looking at Herb's work, you think of Will Rogers' observation that there's no trick to becoming a political humorist when you have the entire United States government working for you. Now, over 35 years ago, 1979, Herb drew one entitled Hostage. Do you think it could play in the Washington Post tomorrow? On the gas tank it says, U.S. government failure to end dependence on foreign oil, and USA is wrapped by the gas hose. And at the height of the Lewinsky scandal, President Clinton proposed the first balanced budget in 30 years, bringing forth Herb's mischievous side. I think you can all see, but on one hand, the president on a tightrope is balancing the budget. On another hand, a dark-haired young woman. And what would a night on her block be without Watergate, for which he shared his 4th Pulitzer Prize with colleagues at the Post? There he is. And the legend at the top with Nixon hiding behind his desk and filing cabinets, he's saying, "Here I am, copper. Come and get me." Now, Bob Woodward told me a story that he and Ben Bradley were at a seminar on Watergate, and the two of them were speaking, and Ben was speaking, and Ben was saying, "Well, you can't believe it, these guys in suits and suitcases and burglar tools and masks breaking into the Watergate." And Bob said, "No, Ben, they didn't have masks." And Ben said, "Yeah, they had masks." It was only later that Bob realized that Ben's memory was guided by Herb's cartoons of Watergate. Finally, in May of 1968, Herb seems to be pondering his country's future. 1968, which faction of the divided civil rights movement will prevail? Does the man in front with the sign, "Progress," bring anyone to mind? Behind is the man says violence. It's called race at the top, and progress is just slightly in front. Barack Obama was 6 years old when that cartoon appeared. Katharine Graham said that 5 editors and 5 publishers all learned a cardinal rule: don't mess with Herb. Do you think an employee ever received a higher accolade from a publisher than these words? He fought for and earned a unique position at the paper, one of complete independence of anybody and everything. And for Herb, it all came from a little black ink bottle. His attitude each day was simple and optimistic. There's always a clean slate, a fresh sheet of paper, a waiting space, and a chance to have another shot at it tomorrow. Now, one more thing. I mentioned that transaction with Phil Graham in the late 50s, that A stock that Herb got for 50 cents a share. Well, it split 72-1, then 8-1, then 12-1. So that cartoonist in the rumpled clothes who never owned a car, who hung out at Doc Dolinsky's drugstore on Wisconsin Avenue and played on the public golf course at Haines Point with working men and women of this city, shocked his friends when his will was read. He left an estate in the neighborhood of $90 million. After taxes, that money went to this foundation, managed by his friends and coworkers, to combat prejudice and improve conditions for the poor, so much in the spirit of Herb's lifelong fight against abuses of power. So Herb's surprising success as an investor means that there's also a small budget for food and wine. So his friends and admirers can meet upstairs tonight and drink a toast to a great man, a good citizen who never stopped thinking about the other guy. Thank you very much.
Will you answer questions?
If you ask me, please.
George has agreed to answer a few questions if you have any. Maybe I'll let you come back and see if
We'll come back and see if there.
anybody have any questions.
When I first came to Washington, as Frank mentioned, I worked for Ed Murrow at the United States Information Agency, and people would say, "What is it?" And I said, telling America's story abroad, but don't ask us any tough questions. So if there is a question, yes, sir.
You were a good friend of his for many years, but now you've been working in a concentrated way on this film for about a year. Tell us something you've learned about him that you didn't know, or something that you caught in a different light from the experience of looking back as you put the film together.
Well, I think I just told you most of it, but what we're learning with these interviews that we're filming, just the enormous respect that people had for Herb, and they see it as so much larger than simply a political cartoonist. That he had these kind of bedrock principles, and when he got onto something, whether it was Mr. Atom, his figure of the atom threat, the atom bomb threat, carried through. He got onto civil rights, he got onto Nixon, he got onto McCarthy, and he just had this tenacity and sense of commitment that he was true to his beliefs. Any others? Yes.
You had said at 32 he won his first Pulitzer Prize. Now, after winning that prize, do you feel that he was inspired to keep on driving harder and harder, or he just felt it was time to relax?
Oh, he evolved during the 30s. I mean, it was really quite amazing when you think that this cartoonist in his 20s and 30s, early 30s, kind of saw the threat of Hitler and Mussolini in a way that most people in the United States didn't. And he went far out, really, attacking, fascism and the potential consequences of it. And like he was so often in his life, he was right. Okay, well, I think that we all welcome upstairs, or do you want to give us our instructions, Frank?
I'm the bus driver.